Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Islam's most sacred place, the Kaaba in Mecca, engulfed in flames. Around it, bodies lie scattered, and the air is filled with screams of anguish. It might seem unimaginable, but this is exactly what happened in the year 6083 AD. But who did this, and why? The answer lies in another river of blood, shed just 1 year earlier in the holy city of Medina. There, a corrupt ruler answered a people's protest with the sword. For 3 long days, a horrific massacre unfolded. Thousands of innocent lives were taken, and even the Prophet's own companions were not spared from the slaughter. And behind all of this was one name, the Umayyad ruler, Yazid. He had one simple demand, that everyone accept his tyranny and submit to his rule. While the entire Arab world fell silent in fear, only one man stood up against this injustice. He was none other than the Prophet Muhammad's own beloved grandson, Imam Hussain. And his one word, no, would give birth to one of the most tragic and blood-soaked chapters in history. To truly understand this epic tragedy and the events that led to the plains of Karbala, stay with us on this journey. The seeds of corruption. To understand why Hussein made his stand, we have to go back in time, not centuries, but just a few decades after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The world he had built on justice and faith was already starting to crumble. Imagine the sound, the thunder of catapults in the dead of night. But this wasn't just any war. This was an attack on the holiest city in Islam, Mecca. In the year 6083, an army sent by the new caliph did the unthinkable. They surrounded the sacred city and launched fireballs, setting the holy Kaaba itself ablaze. Their order was simple and brutal: force every man, woman, and child to bow down in allegiance, any way you can. But this fire was not the beginning of the story. It was the result of a poison that had already started to spread. Just 1 year earlier, in the Prophet's own city, Medina, the people had made a stand. Many of them were the companions of the Prophet Muhammad himself, men who had walked with him, prayed with him, and learned from him. They saw the new ruler as a man of corruption, a man who mocked the very faith he claimed to lead. And so they did what their conscience demanded. They withdrew their support. They refused to follow a leader who was destroying everything the Prophet had built. The ruler's name was Yazid, and his response to this defiance was pure terror. He sent his army into the holy city of Medina with a horrifying command. For 3 long days, the city was handed over to the soldiers. The people who had known the Prophet were hunted down and killed in their own homes. Their possessions were stolen, the city was plundered, and in the ultimate act of evil, the women of the Prophet's city were brutally violated. Thousands were slaughtered in this massacre, a tragedy known as the Incident of Hara. The world was shaken. How could a man calling himself a caliph do this to the Prophet's own city and his companions? This was the man demanding loyalty. This was Yazid from the Umayyad dynasty. He hadn't earned his power through piety or wisdom. He had inherited it because his father Umayyad had broken a sacred peace treaty made with Hussein's older brother Hassan. A treaty was broken, a promise was shattered, all so that a corrupt son could sit on the throne. Yazid was a man who openly lived a life against the core teachings of Islam. Yet he demanded that every single person pledge their life to him. He wanted the entire Muslim world to accept his tyranny, to look the other way as he destroyed the foundations of their faith. And in this storm of fear and corruption, as the world began to bend its knee to a tyrant, one man stood tall. He was the last remaining grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. He carried the blood of his grandfather, but more importantly, he carried his message of truth and justice in his heart. Yazid demanded his allegiance above all others, because he knew that if Hussein bowed, the entire world would follow. But Hussein had a choice to make. Would he give his hand to this tyrant to save his own life and family? Or would he stand up for the principles his grandfather had spent his entire life building, even if it meant paying the ultimate price? In a world drowning in darkness, one man refused to bow. One man chose to stand for justice. His name was Hussein ibn Ali, and his stand would change the course of history forever. The demand for allegiance. After the death of his father, Yazid's first act as caliph was not to pray, not to serve the people, but to secure his throne. His greatest fear was the one man in the entire Muslim world who could not be bought and would not bow to tyranny. The grandson of the Prophet, Hussein ibn Ali. A letter was sent, traveling like a poisonous arrow across the desert to the holy city of Medina. The message inside was simple, but it carried the weight of a sword. The governor of Medina was ordered to find Hussein and force him to pledge his loyalty to Yazid. There was no room for discussion. The letter ended with a chilling command: "If Hussein refuses, bring me his head." When the governor delivered the message, Hussein knew he was standing at a crossroads. To pledge allegiance to Yazid would be to accept a man who drank wine openly, who disrespected the laws of Islam, and who had the blood of the Prophet's companions on his hands. To bow to Yazid was to betray everything his grandfather had stood for. For Hussein, the choice was clear. He refused, but he also knew what Yazid was capable of. He knew that his refusal would bring war to the very streets his grandfather had walked. He would not let the sacred ground of Medina, the city of the Prophet, be stained with blood because of him. So, under the cover of darkness, Hussein made a painful decision. He gathered his family, his sisters, his wives, his children, and left the city he loved. He journeyed to Mecca, hoping to find a place of sanctuary, a place where the laws of God were still respected. But the shadow of Yazid's threat stretched all the way to Mecca. Spies and assassins were sent to the holy city. It became clear that Hussein was a marked man. There were only two options left for him: submission or death. But then something happened. A glimmer of hope appeared from the east. Letters began to pour in from a city called Kufa in modern-day Iraq. Not one or two, but a flood of letters. Thousands of them. The people of Kufa wrote that they had rejected Yazid's rule. They wrote of a city drowning in corruption and injustice, and they begged Hussein to come and lead them back to the light. They'd promised their unwavering support, their swords and their lives. "We are waiting for you," they wrote. "Come, and we will stand with you." Hussein's family and closest friends were worried. They pleaded with him not to go, reminding him of betrayals in the past. They feared it was a trap, but Hussein saw it differently. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about a throne or becoming a king. This was about his duty as the grandson of the Prophet. His grandfather's community was calling for help, and he could not turn his back on them. He saw a chance to reform the nation, to stand against the corruption that was destroying Islam from within. But he would not lead his family into danger blindly. He decided to send his most trusted cousin, Muslim Ibn Aqil, to Kufa first. His mission was to go there to see if the people were truly sincere and to report back. The entire fate of this revolution now rested on one man's journey into the heart of Iraq. Would he find a city ready to stand for justice, or a deadly trap waiting to be sprung? The answer to that question would seal Hussein's fate and change the world forever. The road to Kufa. With the promises from Kufa in his heart, Hussein began his journey. He left the sanctuary of Mecca behind, not with an army hungry for war, but with his family. His sisters, his wives, his young children, and a handful of his most loyal companions. Their mission was not to conquer, but to guide, to answer the call of a community that had begged for a leader to restore the lost message of the Prophet. But as they traveled across the harsh desert, a dark shadow was already falling over the city they were marching towards. Yazid was not a fool. He knew the people of Kufa were restless, so he sent his most ruthless governor, a man known as Ibn Ziyad, to crush the city. And Ibn Ziyad did his job with brutal efficiency. He unleashed a wave of terror. The leaders who had written to Hussein were hunted down. Some were thrown into prisons, their voices silenced. Others were publicly executed, their bodies left as a warning to anyone who dared to stand with Hussein. And many, faced with the choice between death and wealth, chose betrayal. The same hands that had written letters of invitation now took bribes to stand against the man they had invited. The promise of 18,000 supporters vanished into thin air, replaced by fear and treachery. Word of the betrayal finally reached Hussein in the middle of the desert. The city that had promised him an army was now a city under the control of his enemy. He was no longer a leader on his way to his people. He was a man walking into a trap. His companions looked at him, their hearts heavy. They were in the middle of nowhere with their families, their children, and no army to protect them. The logical choice was to turn back, to save themselves. But for Hussein, the path was already chosen. He had not started this journey for power or glory. He had started it for God, and he would see it through to the end. It wasn't long before they were confronted. An army of 1,000 soldiers, led by a general named Al-Hur, blocked their path. They had been sent to stop Hussein, to bring him to Kufa as a prisoner. But as this army approached, it was clear they were in trouble. The desert had been cruel. Their water had run out. The soldiers and their horses were on the verge of collapse, their lips cracked, their bodies weak from thirst. And here, in the face of his own enemies, Hussein showed the world who he was. He saw not soldiers sent to capture him, but thirsty human beings. He turned to his companions and gave an order they would never forget. Give them our water, let them drink, and let their animals drink too. Hassan's family, who had so little water for themselves, shared every last drop with the very men who had come to block their way. For a moment, in the middle of that barren desert, compassion overcame conflict. Al-Hur, the commander of the army, was moved by this incredible act of mercy. He knew he was standing before a man of God, but he was trapped by his orders. He could not let Hassan go to Kufa, but he couldn't bring himself to fight this noble man either. So he forced Hussein's caravan to change direction. He pushed them away from the road, away from any source of water, away from any sign of life. He led them deeper and deeper into the empty, unforgiving desert. Finally, they reached a piece of land. It was dry, empty, and desolate. Hussein stopped his horse and asked for the name of this place. An old man replied, "This land is called Karbala." Hussein's face changed. He knew the name. It was an ancient name, meaning a land of sorrow and affliction. He and his family, surrounded by an army, with no water and no escape, had arrived at their final destination. They had no idea that this barren patch of sand would become their final resting place and the stage for one of history's greatest tragedies. The loyal companions. The plains of Karbala were no longer just a desert. They had become a prison without walls. Under the merciless glare of the sun, Hussein and his small band of 72 followers were completely surrounded. Day by day, the enemy forces grew, swelling into a terrifying ocean of soldiers that numbered a staggering 30,000. The commander of this massive army, Umar ibn Said, had received his chilling orders directly from the Caliph: force Hussein to give his allegiance, or kill him. But the enemy's first weapon was not the sword, it was thirst. In an act of unimaginable cruelty, they blocked all access to the nearby Euphrates River. The cool, flowing water was so close that the camp could see it glistening in the distance, yet it was completely unreachable. For days, Hussein's camp, filled with women and young children, was deprived of a single drop of water. The scorching desert sun beat down on them, and the air was soon filled with the heart-wrenching cries of thirsty children, their small bodies growing weaker with each passing hour. The sound of their weeping was a constant, painful reminder of the brutal choice they faced. Yet, in the face of this unimaginable cruelty, not a single one of Hussein's followers wavered. They refused to bow their necks in allegiance to a tyrant, choosing to stand with their leader, even if it meant certain death. Their resolve was about to be tested in the most profound way imaginable. As the final night descended upon the camp, the night that would come to be known as the Night of Ashura, Hussein knew that this was the last chance for his companions to save themselves. He gathered them inside his tent, a small group of loyal souls facing an endless sea of enemies. He looked at their tired, thirsty faces, and in an ultimate act of love and leadership, he extinguished the lamp, plunging the tent into darkness. In the stillness of the night, his voice rang out, clear and compassionate. "The enemy wants only me," he said. "They have no quarrel with you. I free you from your oath of allegiance. This darkness is your cover. Take your families and escape. I do not want you to die for my sake." Imagine the silence that followed. A silence so heavy you could feel the weight of every soul in that tent. It was the silence of a life-altering choice, the choice between a guaranteed death with honor or a chance to live. Then one voice broke the silence. It was one of his elderly companions. He stood up and said, "Master, are we to leave you, and what excuse would we give to God? How could we face your grandfather, the prophet, on the day of judgment, and tell him that we abandoned you in your greatest hour of need?" Then another voice rose, and another, and soon the tent was filled with declarations of unwavering loyalty. They were not just followers, they were family. They cried out, "By God, we will never leave you. We will protect you with our blood, our souls, and our lives. If we knew that we would be killed, and our bodies burned to ash, and the winds would scatter us, and this would happen not once, but 1,000 times over, we would still not abandon you." Tears streamed down Hussein's face, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. He looked at them and said, "I have never known companions more loyal or more righteous than you." The night passed in prayer and quiet preparation. As the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, it was not the dawn of a new day, but the dawn of a day that would be etched into history forever. The day of the ultimate sacrifice was about to begin. The sons of Bani Hashim. The sun rose on the 10th day of Muharram. This was the day. This was Ashura. For days the cries of thirsty children had filled the air. For days Hussein and his followers had been surrounded, cut off from the world. Now the time for talking was over. The peace was shattered by a single arrow, fired by the enemy commander Umar ibn Saad. It was a declaration. There would be no mercy. The battle had begun. What happened next was a display of loyalty the world had never seen. Hussein's 72 companions, thirsty and exhausted, charged into an army of 30,000. They knew they could not win. They knew they would not survive, but they didn't fight for victory. They fought for honor. They fought for their imam. They became a human shield around Hussein, a living wall of loyalty. Each time an arrow flew towards Hussein, one of his companions would step in its path. Each time a sword was raised against him, a loyal friend would take the blow. They fought like lions, protecting their pride, creating legends with every last drop of their blood. One by one they fell. Each man a hero, each death a story of unbelievable courage. And then, when the last of his loyal friends had fallen, a heavy silence fell upon the battlefield. The first line of defense was gone. It was now the turn of Hussein's own family. The sons of Bani Hashim, his brothers, his nephews, his own beloved sons. They had watched their friends die, and now it was their time. One by one they came to their imam, their uncle, their father, to say their last goodbye. They walked onto that battlefield knowing they would never walk back. Young men in the prime of their life, like Hussein's own son, Ali al-Akbar, whose face was said to be a mirror image of the Prophet Muhammad himself. They fought with a strength that terrified the enemy army. They were the bloodline of the Lion of God, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and their bravery shook the foundations of Karbala. But even lions cannot fight an ocean. They were butchered one after another. They died with the name of God on their lips, refusing to bow to Yazid, choosing an honorable death over a life of humiliation. With every soul that departed, another piece of Hussein's heart was torn away. He was now watching his own flesh and blood being cut down before his very eyes. The battlefield was now covered with the bodies of his friends and his family. His army was gone. Soon only one man would be left to protect the women and children, the one who held the flag of Hussein's camp high, his brother, his commander, the Lion of Karbala, the flag bearer. With the last of the companions having fallen, and the sons of Bani Hashim martyred one by one, the camp of Hussein was left almost defenseless. The cries of the women and children grew louder, but one cry was the most painful of all, the cry for water. Among the few men left was Hussein's half-brother, the commander of his small army and the bearer of its flag, Abbas ibn Ali. Abbas was a warrior so legendary, so renowned for his courage, that not a single soldier in the 30,000-man army dared to face him one-on-one. They called him the Lion. But it wasn't the sound of swords or the roar of the enemy that was breaking this lion's heart. It was the soft, desperate cries of the children. He could no longer bear to see his nieces and nephews, especially Hussein's 6-month-old infant, suffering from a thirst that was slowly killing them. He went to his brother Hussein and begged for permission. "Let me go," he said. "Let me bring them water." With a heavy heart, Hussein agreed. With the empty water skin on his shoulder and the flag held high, Abbas mounted his horse. He wasn't riding to fight a battle, he was on a mission of mercy. He charged towards the Euphrates River, tearing through the enemy ranks like a storm. The soldiers, too cowardly to face him head-on, scattered in his path. He reached the riverbank, jumped into the cool, life-giving water, and filled the skin to the brim. He himself had not had a drop of water in 3 days. His own lips were cracked, his throat was burning. He scooped up a handful of water and brought it towards his lips, but then he stopped. He looked at the water in his hand and thought, "How can I drink while the children of the Prophet are still thirsty?" He threw the water back into the river. His loyalty was greater than his own life, greater even than his own thirst, but the ride back was a trap. Knowing they couldn't defeat him in a fair fight, the enemy hid behind the palm trees and ambushed him. A sword struck his right arm from behind, and it fell to the ground, but Abbas did not fall. He caught the water skin and the flag with his left hand and continued to charge forward. Then, another blow from the other side. His left arm was also severed. Even then, he did not give up. With a final surge of strength, he clenched the strap of the water skin with his teeth, desperate to complete his mission. But it was not to be. A final cowardly arrow pierced the water skin, and all the water, all the hope for the crying children, drained away onto the desert sand. blinded by another arrow. He finally fell from his horse, calling out one last time, "Oh brother, come to me." When Hussain reached him, he saw his brother, his flag-bearer, the protector of his family, lying broken on the banks of the river he could not bring back. Hussain fell to his knees and let out a cry that echoed across the plains of Karbala. Now he wept. Now my back is broken. The flag had fallen, and with it the last protector of Hussein's camp was gone. The cry of thirst. The battlefield of Karbala had fallen into a deafening silence. One by one, Hussein's loyal companions and brave family members had given their lives, and now he stood utterly alone. The echoes of swords and battle cries had faded, replaced by the sound of weeping from his desolate camp. Among the cries of the grieving women, one sound pierced Hussein's heart more than any sword ever could: the faint, desperate cry of his 6-month-old infant son, Ali Asghar. For 3 days, not a single drop of water had touched the baby's lips. His small body was severely dehydrated, his tongue was dry, and his cries were growing weaker with every passing moment. He was on the verge of death, not from a weapon, but from thirst. Hussain could bear it no longer. He walked back to his tent, took the tiny, frail baby in his arms, and cradled him gently. He knew there was only one thing left to do. With his infant son held close to his chest, Hussain walked out onto the battlefield and stood before the thousands of soldiers in the enemy army. He lifted the baby high for everyone to see, his small, fragile form a stark contrast to the brutal scene of war around them. In a voice filled with the pain of a father, he pleaded, "O people, you may consider me a sinner, but what sin has this infant committed? He is dying of thirst. If you have no mercy for me, then at least have mercy on this innocent child. Give him just a single drop of water." He was not asking for himself. He was a father begging for his child's life. For a moment, a wave of shock and shame seemed to pass through the enemy ranks. Some soldiers began to weep, their humanity stirred by the sight of the dying baby. It seemed that even in the hearts of his enemies, a flicker of compassion might be found. But that flicker was quickly extinguished. Fearing that this act of compassion could turn his army against him, the commander Umar ibn Sa'd turned to his most ruthless archer, a man named Harmalah. He gave a horrifying command: "Silence Hussain." Harmalah drew his bow, but he did not aim at Hussain. Instead, he took aim at the tiny, exposed neck of the baby. He fired a heavy, 3-pronged arrow, an arrow designed to bring down charging horses, and it flew across the desert with a terrible hiss. The arrow struck Ali Asghar in the throat, pinning the infant's neck to his father's arm. Hussain looked down in horror as his baby shuddered and then went still. The warmth of his son's innocent blood filled his cupped hands. He looked up at the sky, his heart shattered into a million pieces, and threw the blood towards the heavens, crying out, "O Lord, witness this crime." It is said that not a single drop of that innocent blood ever fell back to earth. In that moment, the final line of humanity was crossed. The sky itself seemed to weep, and the world held its breath, for the ultimate sacrifice was now at hand. The ultimate sacrifice. The sun beat down on the plains of Karbala, now a silent field of the fallen. Every companion, every brother, every nephew, every son, all were gone. Hussain ibn Ali was now utterly alone. His body was a canvas of wounds, his heart heavy with a grief that no man should ever have to bear. But his spirit, his resolve, remained unbroken. He returned to the tattered tents one last time to say his final farewell. He looked into the eyes of his beloved sister Zainab, the guardian of his family. He then turned to his only surviving son, Ali Zain al-Abidin, who lay consumed by a severe fever, too sick to even stand, let alone fight. This sickness, a twist of fate, would be what saved his life and allowed the story of Karbala to be told. Hussain held him close, passing on the responsibility of carrying his message to the world. Then, with a heavy heart but a firm soul, he mounted his horse and rode onto the battlefield for his final stand. It was a sight that would be seared into the memory of history. One man, alone, facing an army of thousands. He charged into the heart of the enemy like a lion uncaged. He fought with a courage that defied belief. The very soldiers who had mocked him just hours before now fell back in terror. No one dared to face him one-on-one. They had seen his strength, his skill, and they knew they were no match for the grandson of the Prophet. So they resorted to cowardice. From all sides they attacked him with a cowardly storm of arrows and stones, refusing to face him with honor. Wounded, exhausted, and bleeding from countless injuries, he finally fell from his horse. But he fell not with a cry of defeat, but with the name of God on his lips. Even in his final moments, as his life slipped away, he did not forget his Lord. With the last of his strength, he pushed himself up and placed his forehead on the hot sand in a final act of prostration. And as he lay there, in that sacred moment of prayer, he whispered his final words, "O God, you are the one I trust in every adversity, my hope in every distress. I endured it with you and appealed to you about it, due to my devotion to you alone. So you relieved me of it and removed it. For you are the master of every grace, the source of every blessing, and the completion of every wish." It was then, in this most sacred act of worship, that a man named Shimmer, whose name would live in infamy forever, stepped forward. And with the army watching, he committed the most brutal act of all. He beheaded the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, the night of grief. The battle was over. The sounds of swords clashing had been replaced by a chilling silence. Hussain, the grandson of the Prophet, lay martyred on the sands of Karbala. But for the army of Yazid, the killing was not enough. The tragedy was not over. In fact, for the women and children of Hussein's family, the terror had only just begun. Like a pack of hungry wolves, the soldiers descended upon the camp. They showed no mercy, no respect for the dead. In the ultimate act of hatred, they were ordered to trample the bodies of Hussein and his fallen companions with their horses, desecrating them in a way that shocked the heavens. Then they turned their fury on the living. They stormed the tents of Hussein's family, not as soldiers but as looters and thieves. They ripped the veils from the heads of the Prophet's granddaughters. They pulled the earrings from the ears of the crying children, leaving them bleeding and terrified. Nothing was spared, and then they set the tents on fire. The daughters of the Prophet's household, who had never stepped out of their homes without their veils, were now forced to run barefoot from one burning tent to another, with nothing to cover their heads. The night sky, which had witnessed their prayers, was now filled with smoke, fire, and the screams of innocent children. But their suffering was not over. Hussein's family, his sister Zainab, his sick son, and the terrified women and children were taken as captives. They were chained and forced to march on a long, brutal journey across the desert to Sham, which is modern-day Syria. They were paraded through the streets of different cities, displayed like trophies of war to be presented before the tyrant Yazid in his palace. Among the captives was Hussein's beloved young daughter, Sakina. She had witnessed the death of her father, her brothers, and her uncles. She had survived the thirst, the fire, and the terrifying march, but her small heart could take no more. Trapped in the cold, dark dungeons of Yazid's prison, she would cry herself to sleep every night, asking for her father. One night, to mock her grief, Yazid ordered his guards to take her father's severed head to her cell. It is said that when she saw her father's face, she hugged it close, cried out one last time, and her little soul left her body. She died, right there, in the darkness of that prison. Yazid thought he had won. He thought he had silenced the family of the Prophet forever. He had killed Hussein. He had imprisoned his family. But he had forgotten one thing. He had forgotten about the survivors. He had forgotten about the power of their voices. The story of Karbala was not over. In the courts of the tyrant himself, a new battle was about to begin. An eternal legacy. Yazid thought he had won. He had the throne, the power, and the severed heads of his enemies. But what is a victory if it is built on the blood of the innocent? History tells us that true victory belongs to those who stand for something greater than themselves. Yazid, the tyrant, would die just 3 years after Karbala. His accomplices, the men who carried out his brutal orders, were eventually hunted down and brought to justice. The Umayyad dynasty would rule for another 80 years, but their foundation was cracked forever. Hussein's sacrifice had exposed them for what they were. The mask of holiness was torn away, and the people began to see the difference between a king who demands power and a leader who earns respect. In his death, Hussein protected the true, compassionate message of his grandfather from being erased forever. But how did this story survive? How did a massacre in the middle of a forgotten desert become a story told by billions, even after 1400 years? It survived because of the ones who were left behind. Hussein's son, Ali Zain al-Abidin, was saved from the battle by a severe illness, a blessing in disguise from God. He and his courageous aunt, Zainab, the sister of Hussein, carried the story of Karbala with them. They were the eyewitnesses. They endured the pain of captivity, but they refused to be silenced. In the courts of the very tyrants who had killed their family, they spoke the truth with a bravery that shook the thrones of the unjust. They encourage people to never forget what happened, to gather and remember the sacrifice, especially during the first 10 nights of the month of Muharram. And that is what people have done, year after year, century after century. It is why even today, millions across the world from all walks of life gather to remember Hussein, not just to mourn, but to be inspired. In their hearts they carry the beautiful and profound words of the Prophet Muhammad himself, who wept for his grandson when he was just a child, knowing the tragedy that awaited him. He held Hussein and famously said, "Hussein is from me, and I am from Hussein." In these words, he tied his own legacy to the stand his grandson would one day make. And that is why the story of Hussein is not just for one time or one people. It is a story for all of humanity. It is a timeless symbol of standing for truth against falsehood, of choosing principle over power, and of finding victory even in apparent defeat. His sacrifice reminds us that in every generation, in every land, we will face our own Karbala, a moment where we must choose between what is easy and what is right. That is why for millions around the world, the message is eternal. Every day is Ashura, and every land is Karbala. The story of Imam Hussain is vast and filled with details of immense bravery from each of his companions and family members, especially his sister Zainab bint Ali, who fearlessly confronted Yazid in his own court. This presentation only scratches the surface, serving to raise awareness and inspire you to learn more. If this story of sacrifice and courage has touched your heart, and you want to explore more profound tales of faith, courage, and sacrifice from history, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel, Religious Story Movies. Your subscription helps us bring more of these eternal legacies to you. Thank you for watching.